Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Jonathan. Like he mentioned, I'm honored to present today on joint work with Dario, Matteo, and Sarah during my time at the Federal Reserve on whether geopolitical risks raise or lower inflation. Uh, Before I go ahead and proceed, just to note, the usual disclaimer applies. The views are not necessarily of the Federal Reserve, but of the authors. Okay. Uh, so when you consider the global environment over the past few years, there are two kind of key features to note. Uh, Generally, people would consider first and foremost the sustained period of elevated inflation, and secondly, the increase and volatility of adverse geopolitical events. So we had principals at the Federal Reserve and generally among popular discourse who were curious as to whether these two phenomena were related. And what makes this question particularly interesting is that when you look at it from the viewpoint of the theory, there isn't necessarily a net clear effect. On the one hand, when you look at the supply side, you can see that there's disruption of trade, there are bottlenecks, commodity prices, and flight to safety to the dollar might necessarily push inflation up uh, in the face of a conflict. But on the other hand, when there's conflict, when there are geopolitical tensions, we see that global economic activity tends to depress, and there's also increases in uncertainty. Additionally, the actions of monetary and fiscal policymakers could push inflation in either direction. So, given sort of the ambiguity from the theory, we decided to take an agnostic approach to theory altogether and look at this question from a historical lens. So in doing so, we use 120 years of data, a pretty comprehensive panel data set, and various empirical techniques, including panel VARs, various panel regression analyses, country-specific exercises, and a global simulation to examine the association between higher geopolitical risk and inflation. So I'm not going to leave you hanging very long. We have one main headline finding. And so if there's anything to take away from this presentation, it's that we find that geopolitical risks do indeed raise inflation. And we can see this both on the aggregate level. Our top panel that we show here plots the geopolitical risk index that we use as our measure of adverse geopolitical risk. I'll explain a bit more how exactly we measure and define that later on. But we see that when geopolitical risk increases, when there are spikes in geopolitical risk, we also find that the global inflation measured as sort of the global aggregate across countries tends to spike around the same time. So we see positive co-movement there. And this occurs all throughout the period in our sample. Now, not only does this hold in the aggregate, but it also holds in the cross section as well, where we see that during those same spikes in geopolitical risk, we find that there are a higher share of countries that are experiencing high inflation relative to their long run mean. We also see that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence for people connecting these two ideas of increasing geopolitical risk, adverse geopolitical events, and inflationary concerns. We thought it would be interesting to show you just a few sort of motivational snapshots of how, in the press, sort of at large, people do tend to connect these two ideas. So you can see here we have a few snapshots of newspaper articles over the past 100 years or so, where these highlighted portions mention both some sort of war conflict and a related concern regarding why there may be inflation afterwards. So we can see that this occurs during large global conflicts like World War II, which you see in sort of the second and fourth panel here, but as well as sort of other conflicts like, we have an example of the Falklands War in Argentina and also from the Vietnam War. So this is a pretty common uh, concern that occurs in all sorts of geopolitical conflicts. So with all of that motivation in mind, let's take a dive into the data. We rely on two main data sets for this analysis. The first is a...
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah, yes, we have a question from Daniel Nathan.
Okay, excellent.
Hi, Maddie. I have a clarifying question regarding your motivation. I mean, I would assume that what would there be? I mean, if you average all geopolitical risk and see what happens, you're going to get an answer. But what would any geopolitical risk be similar? Like you said in your motivation, there are some forces that supply side, demand side. It depends on. I feel like it's very idiosyncratic. I don't understand. Why would there be one answer?
Well, I suppose. I mean, we will kind of get into. We do run a few heterogeneity exercises, so I'll show you sort of how exactly these forces may vary by country. But we were just curious to see if there was sort of an aggregate impact, and of course, every situation is different, but there are sort of common components to a geopolitical shock. It's a pretty exogenous shock, and we'll explain sort of the mechanism as to how we find that on net the expansionary policy decisions tend to outweigh on the aggregate level the sort of downward forces of economic activity. So, I mean, I do agree that there is a lot of heterogeneity in this, but we will show throughout our analysis that, sort of taking no main prior as to whether we think that the relationship goes one way or another, we tend to find consistently that in the cross section, when you look at country specific evidence, when you look at aggregate evidence, we just consistently find this inflationary effect on net.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, then I'll get into the data. So like I said, our first main data set is a panel of historical annual data. Our coverage runs from 1900 through 2021, and we base our coverage on the geopolitical risk data that we have available to us. So we use 44 countries in our sample. 17 of those are advanced economies, or what we call advanced economies, and the remainder are emerging economies, developing countries. So we have a good balance of a wide variety of economies in our sample, which we consider to be a good thing. In addition, we, of course, have a measure of inflation. We spent a lot of time sort of compiling together, harmonizing different measures to cover sort of the widest extent of data available and really have a solid long-run historical panel. So, we pull in sources from the IMF. We rely a lot on Jorda, Sherlock, and Taylor's macro history database, Reinhardt and Rogoff, and we go ahead and harmonize all of those into one series. So in addition to our measures of geopolitical risk and inflation, we also have a measure of real GDP, as well as policy indicators, including military and public expenditures, debt, money growth, trade, all compiled together from various different sources. And we also build two new news-based textual series to measure sentiment around shortages and aggregate demand. So that's our first data set. We also then, for an exercise that I'll describe later in the end, we use a global monthly data set that has coverage from the 1970s through 2022. And this is to capture sort of the higher frequency response to geopolitical risk that may occur. And so in doing so, we can include not just sort of world macro variables like GDP, inflation, consumer confidence, but financial variables as well. And so we get to see a bit more of a financial response through stock prices, dollar exchange rate, commodity prices, etc. Okay, and as promised, I'm going to be particular about how we define geopolitical risk throughout the rest of this project. And so we define geopolitical risk as the threat, realization, and escalation of adverse events associated with wars, terrorism, and any tensions among states and political actors that affect the peaceful course of international relations. It's a bit of a wordy definition. What that really means is that in our measure of geopolitical risk, we capture both the realization or onset of a conflict or adverse event, a terrorist attack, a war, some sort of unexpected conflict, as well as the increase in the probability of a future negative event, any increase in threats, intentions, buildups, anything of that sort. And we also measure sort of the intensive margin of negative geopolitical events. Now, this measure of geopolitical risk was developed by my co-authors, Dario and Matteo. They do a lot of validation regarding the validity of the index relative to other similar indices. So if you have a lot of specific questions about the construction of these indices, I happily refer you to their 2022 AER paper. Yes, is there another question?
Yeah, we have a question from Fred Jawadi.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Hi everyone. I have a small question about the data. While looking at the data, we see financial variables and we see macroeconomic variable, but I cannot see a variable about people behavior, psychology of people. Indeed, I believe that this relationship between inflation and geopolitical risk can work like thanks to or because of the behavior of people. Like, how are they feeling about that? So, for example, what about the feeling of people, sentiment of people, their confidence, so about their expectation? Which vibe we can capture that movement?
No, it's a very good question. So we, in our global data set, we do include a measure of consumer confidence. So that helps speak a bit to that. I do agree it would be excellent to have some sort of capture of, consumer sentiment or expectations in our panel data set. We find, if we wanted to get coverage across all of the countries in our panel, it would be very difficult to find a measure that runs to the historical depth that we would like for it to do so. We do have a measure of, like I mentioned, our text-based measure of sentiment around aggregate demand. We'll use that in a US specific exercise. So I'll describe a bit more in detail what we do there, but that helps capture at least a sentiment around private demand, which begins to sort of proxy that sense of consumer, sentiment around conflict, the private sentiment. So that's sort of our best proxies we have for this project so far.
Okay, thank you.
So as I was saying, I'm just going to give a very high level, broad description of how we measure this geopolitical risk index. And this is going to be sort of the same methodology that we use for all of the text-based indices in this project. But for our geopolitical risk index, it's a news-based index. So what we do is we measure the frequency of articles that mention some sort of geopolitical word, think war, nuclear, attack, anything in that vein. That's linked with some sort of verb describing an action, related to build up, some sort of, sense of an action actually being implemented. And so we take that those sets of articles that mention those two sort of categories of words, and we measure their share with regards to all of the articles that we have in our sample for that period. So for these indices, we use the historical databases from the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, and the Washington Post. And we plot for you here our geopolitical risk index from 1900 to 2020, just so you get a sense of what it looks like. We see that it captures pretty much all of the major conflicts of the 20th century pretty well, including, sort of both our very large conflicts as well as certain high periods of threat. You can see in particular the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Suez Crisis. We see 9/11, the Paris terror attacks. So it captures a pretty good and wide array of geopolitical events. One other thing to note is that our measure of geopolitical risk is pretty spiky. So one concern that people may have is whether sort of the political leanings of our newspapers, the precise selection of our newspapers may unduly influence the geopolitical risk index. But given the spiky nature of geopolitical events and sort of they tend to be pretty unexpected, we'll find that regardless of, the leanings of a newspaper, they're going to cover the event. So we're going to pick that up no matter what. So this is a pretty robust index. Okay. What we also have and what we use for the entirety of our panel analyses are country-specific geopolitical risk indices. So these are measured in the same way as our global index, but we also include the connection articles that are mentioning both geopolitical words, but also the name of a country or their capital city in question. So what we plot here are if various examples of country-specific geopolitical risk indices and their domestic inflation. And we see that much like the evidence I showed earlier, sort of at the more aggregate level, we find similar positive co-movements between country-specific geopolitical risk and inflation. So we see that this holds true not just for sort of large advanced economies like the United States and the United Kingdom, but a variety of countries as well, and that these spikes hold throughout the entire sample, like I mentioned earlier. So you can see in particular, South Africa, there's a large bump in the 80s in both geopolitical risk and inflation. We see in Chile as well, and Thailand. So these hold pretty strongly across the countries in our sample. So having thoroughly described our data, now going to present to you some of the results of our analyses. So what we first run is a pretty simple bivariate panel VAR using geopolitical risk and inflation. So this model uses two lags. We bootstrap our standard errors. We use a pretty standard simple specification. And we use a Cholesky decomposition of the covariance matrix where we order our country specific geopolitical risk indices first. And we start with this bivariate model just to take advantage of the fullest sort of spectrum of data that we have available in our sample. Once we start adding in other indicators, we're going to have to begin to limit our sample. And so we wanted to have a really clean, full, balanced panel at first to examine sort of the fullest extent of this relationship. And when we do so, we see pretty clearly a one standard deviation shock to geopolitical risk raises inflation about 3 percentage points in the first few years. So if you want sort of another headline image to take away from you from this presentation, this is one to keep in mind. Of course, it'd be a little boring if I just left it at that. So we do next add in the rest of our indicators that we have in our sample to begin to see how the transmission mechanism works in this relationship. So when we do so, we end up having to cut out a few countries. We limit some observations. So the first thing to know is that even with the change in our sample, we still have a pretty strong effect of a shock to GPR on inflation, inflation still increases about 2 percentage points. Further, we see that this relationship is channeled both through the supply side, where we see a decline in international trade and an increase in sentiment about shortages, concerns about bottlenecks, rationing, scarcity, anything like that. But we also see the policy mechanism through which this moves, in that, in light of a geopolitical risk shock, we see that military expenditure as a share of GDP goes up. Governments have to finance their wars, their conflicts. So through that, they have to decide, do we try and inflate away our debt? Do we try and increase our deficits? So we see that both debt to GDP and money growth increase, and government expenditures at large. And this all filters through into inflation. Finally, one more kind of curious detail to note is that as we had discussed in our sort of analysis of the theory, global activity, economic activity does decline as a result of the shock. So we find that, again, the net impact of inflation rises despite the decline in GDP. Okay, so we next look at a couple of counterfactuals to sort of get a sense of the composition of these effects. Now, before I go any further, I should acknowledge this is all very much subject to the Lucas critique. Once you start meeting responses, we're not in the same world anymore. Policy responses, economic responses will change, but we see this more as just an accounting exercise to get a sense of more of a quantity of the response. So in particular, what we think is important to take away from these exercises is the importance of the policy channel in our analysis. That is, when you hold the sort of government and military expenditure fixed at baseline, we see that inflation doesn't rise nearly as much as it does in our initial VAR. And shortages also doesn't go up as much, but that comes at the expense of a larger decrease in activity. So this really reflects the trade-offs that policymakers are facing with regards to, what concerns do they respond to during a geopolitical risk sort of shock, a negative geopolitical event. Additionally, we also see that when we hold our supply side forces fixed at baseline, we similarly see a smaller increase in inflation, though not quite to the same degree, but activity remains roughly the same. Okay, so in all of our panel analyses so far, we've been holding the elasticities of our responses to geopolitical risk constant across countries. So we next want to examine a bit the potential heterogeneity between countries. So we do this running a few panel regressions where on the left-hand side, we have the change from the T-1 to the 3-year ahead response in our variable of interest, inflation, all of our policy indicators. And on the right-hand side, we have country fixed effects and our country-specific geopolitical risk indices. So what I have for you below in this slide are the plotted betas of these regressions, where we have the inflation response on the left-hand side and the various indicator or policy responses on the x-axis. So what we take away from these exercises, first and foremost, is that, yes, there is a degree of spread across countries in all of these plots. We do see that there is a degree of heterogeneity across countries, but there's also a distinct cluster in many of these plots. So that shows that, there are relatively similar responses. But we can also see that the degree to which there is heterogeneity in our sample, all of the relations run sort of in the direction that we would expect given the results of our VAR. In particular, the response of inflation lines up when we look at the response of GDP, military spending, money growth, and trade. In particular, our military spending response is pretty positive and robust in its heterogeneity. So we can see that countries that tend to spend more on defense in response to a geopolitical risk shock also tend to experience a higher degree of inflation. And this occurs even when we, for example, take out Japan, which is sort of a crazy, almost outlier in the sample. But yeah, that's sort of, we see strong responses in all of our indicators. The one exception is our public debt indicator, but that relatively makes sense. There's a lot of varying concerns that governments are responding to when, they unintentionally build up their public debt. So it makes sense that it's a bit of a messier indicator. Okay, and in our next table, we run sort of one large robustness exercise with many different iterations of regressions. So what we have here are the effects of geopolitical risk on inflation, observing the change between the sort of T-1 level and the change at different horizons. So we see the contemporaneous response, the 1 year ahead, 2 year ahead, 3 year ahead, 4 year ahead response. And what we can take away from this table is that overall, the effects of GPR on inflation hold pretty consistently to our baseline. First, it lines up well with our panel VR analysis, but also it holds consistently regardless of the controls that we test on these regressions. For example, when we control for the global level of GPR, we find that the sort of domestic country-specific residual is still pretty positive and roughly, only slightly attenuated with regards to our baseline estimate. I would refer you mostly to our T+2 response, given that's the 2 year ahead response. We also see that the response holds pretty similarly across both advanced and emerging economies. So we know that there isn't one subset of countries that is particularly driving our response. And we also see that when we slice our sample to only the post-1950s response, we find that, again, we have a roughly consistent estimate. So in particular, that means that our analysis isn't solely driven by the effects of World War I and World War II. I believe we have a question.
Yes, a question from Yossi.
Yes, thank you. Do you have a control for the monetary regime? Because I would imagine that if military spending is financed by printing money, this is going to be inflationary, but in recent 20, 30 years, maybe a bit more in more advanced economies, that wasn't really the case. So that may change the result.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We haven't controlled for it in sort of this set of regressions. Again, we include sort of a sense of monetary growth, money supply in our VAR analyses. So we see how that interplays there, but we don't have it in this set, but it would be very interesting to look at. So that's a good point you raise. Thank you.
Thanks.
We have also a question from Fred Jawadi.
Okay.
Yeah. It's one question about whether you take into account that the countries in the sample do not all deal with a formal inflation target. So does it make a difference? So if I have a country for which the central bank does deal with the formal inflation target, okay, then the inflation could react with that manner. But what about if I'm going to make the difference between formal or no formal inflation target? Does it make sense for the result?
Yeah. So again, we haven't necessarily looked at that either. On the whole, we tend to abstract away from sort of specific country states or policy regimes at whole. I mean, we analyze their policy responses, but not necessarily formal targets or anything of the like. I mean, when you look at a panel that runs this long, you're going to start to see a lot of heterogeneity kind of within countries. You know, their policy changes a lot over the course of 100 years, and what exactly constitutes a formal inflation target might vary. So we don't have that in this current analysis. Again, could be interesting to look at. We'd have to do a lot of sort of evaluation of how exactly we want to define that. But again, what we do here is we at least control for, or we inspect different slices of economic sort of status. In particular, again, when we control for both advanced and emerging economies, those kind of constitute two different economic sort of states of development. So while it's not exactly the same indicator or a precise sort of response or control you're looking for, it does get a sense that like even when we start to condition on different regimes, we still have a relatively consistent response.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So again, we see, I mean, there are many ways that we could try and control for different indicators in our sample. Again, we'd have to collect more data on that, which can be a little bit costly for a panel of this size. But overall, no matter how you slice or dice it, we have relatively consistent responses. Additionally, we also run a few quantile exercises to start to capture the distributional consequences. After all, we are measuring a measure that does include a degree of risk, a degree of uncertainty. So what we see when we run quantile regressions is that first and foremost, our median estimates do line up relatively closely to our baseline OLS estimates. And that means that we aren't necessarily worried about our results being unduly pulled by one tail or another. You know, this isn't just driven by a few crazy hyperinflationary episodes, but there's a relatively good degree of centeredness about it. That being said, we do see that the distribution does widen with regards to the response of geopolitical risk on inflation. That is both the 10th quantile estimates and the 90th quantile estimates spread out relative to the median estimates. And further, we do notice a considerable degree of upside risk to inflation. That is the 90th quantile estimates relative to the 10th quantile increase more. Okay, so now that we've examined the panel at large, let's zoom in to the United States in particular. And we run a US specific VAR for a couple of reasons. The first is that the experience of the United States is pretty unique across countries at large in the last century or so, and that they've been involved in a lot and a wide degree of conflicts. However, they've managed to escape relatively unscathed and have not faced a lot of conflict on their own soil. Perhaps the only exception is 9/11 or maybe Pearl Harbor, but neither of those events had very long-lasting sort of domestic ramifications with regards to conflict. Additionally, we simply have so much more data for the United States relative to other countries. Not only do we have a more robust news index about shortages, or given our sample that we're pulling from US newspapers, but we can also formally implement our aggregate demand index, which, as I mentioned earlier, captures sort of a sentiment about private aggregate demand, how people feel about sort of their spending, buying, their budgets, etc. And additionally, we can also take advantage of other indices and the work of others and start to incorporate their indicators into our analysis. In particular, we're going to examine the interplay of geopolitical risk with Valerie Ramey's indicator on military news spending. Okay, so we run pretty much the same VR setup as we did for the panel, but we only include data on the United States. And here are results using the indicators that we have here. In particular, first and foremost, we see that the inflation response is pretty consistent. We still see about a 2 percentage point increase in inflation. And most of our policy indicators also run in the same direction. So what I would like to highlight from this analysis, first and foremost, is the responses of GDP and private demand. That is, unlike our panel at large, we see a positive increase in GDP, and that reflects the notion that public spending, in particular, spending on defense, tends to go up so much that it offsets the softening of private demand, which we see given our decline in our demand news indicator. So a lot of this is in particular driven by the first half of our sample. The United States economy ran really hot during World War II. Industrial production was about, I think, like 25% during those years. So when you actually cut the sample to the post-1950s period, we do see that GDP does start to decline and align more with our panel at large. But this does sort of feature an interesting historical analysis of the United States. Secondly, we also find that this analysis helps confirm our transmission mechanism, in particular with regards to timing. That is, we first see, the shock to geopolitical risk, and then before anything else, we see that the news on future military spending, as measured by Ramey's indicator in the lower left-hand corner, goes up first. Then we see the actual realization of that military spending as a share of GDP, and then it filters through to debt and other government expenditure and to inflation. So this really helps sort of align the story that we have in mind when we're examining the mechanisms. Okay, and I have one more exercise to discuss with you all, and that's a global exercise using a structural time series bar. So this uses our second data set on using monthly global data from the 1970s, and we do so to take advantage of a higher frequency data set and trace the effects of faster moving variables, in particular financial variables. One other reason to sort of zoom out and explore things on a global level is that now we can use the sub-indices that we have of our global geopolitical risk index, including a geopolitical X index, which only captures the realization or onset of an adverse geopolitical event, as well as the geopolitical threats index, which captures the higher potential or higher threat of future events. So in splitting apart these two sub-indices, we can sort of get a more precise notion of the effects of the onset versus the increase in uncertainty or threat related with a geopolitical shock. Now, we run this exercise and construct a simulation around the Russia-Ukraine war. So what we do in this exercise is that we extract the historical series of GPT and GPA shocks, and we calibrate the GPT and GPA shocks that occurred between January and April of 2022, and use those shocks to run a forecast conditional only on those few months of shocks and see how inflation and GDP move in the following year. And when we do so, we see first and foremost that inflation increases relative to a no inflation, no conflict baseline in the first few months following the invasion. And they increased by about 1.25, close to 1.5 percentage points, and remain elevated in the year ahead. Similarly, we also see a decline in world GDP by about 1.5 percentage points at its trough. So again, we see consistent directional impacts that we saw in our panel exercises.
Lee?
Yes.
Yeah, we have a question from Yuda Porat.
Okay, excellent.
Hello. So about this last exercise, so first of all, obviously this is only an in sample. You can't do this out of sample because you're looking at what happens afterwards. Why did you pick, or why did you choose only the Russia-Ukraine war? I mean, if you're talking about a sample since the 70s, you've got a large number of wars over many countries. Like even if you compared this to a few other, whether it's for US Desert Storm, or you could pick a number, you could pick several other, maybe many, but several other conflicts and see if you're getting similar effects.
Yeah. Yeah. So no.
Another tiny thing is that the 2-letter code for Ukraine is UA, not UK, but that's it just says in the top of the slide.
Okay. Oh, good to know. Yeah. We'll fix that for next time. But I suppose with regards to your first question, we were primarily interested in looking at a more real-time scenario, and so really this exercise came about as a real-time response to the invasion. It was sort of born out of a policy exercise where we were trying to examine how this war in particular would forecast. We ran this exercise in May of 2022, so we didn't know what was going to happen in the following year. So while we could have, baked in a lot more conflicts, we really were only curious in the series of shocks that occurred between January and April of 2022. So it was just more a matter of the perspective that we wanted to adopt in this exercise and show that we can take these analyses and apply them to, current, relatively current unfolding conflicts.
So this doesn't include the next year of data. This is only data up to May 2022.
Yes, exactly. I should clarify. No, this only includes data through, actually in particular, April of 2022, and then we ran the forecast conditional on the shocks of the prior 4 months to obtain a prediction of what occurred or would occur, which brings me to my next point in that obviously a lot of time has passed since 2022, and we have the realization of the data. And what we see is that obviously, world inflation increased more, by more than just 1.5 percentage points. I think we capture roughly about a third of the response in this exercise, but that's not entirely unexpected. There are many other forces beyond just the geopolitical that were occurring, in 2022 and 2023. So the fact that it captures about a third lines up roughly with, the degree of shocks that we expect that the world economy experienced. Similarly, world GDP did not decline quite so much, but that reflects a lot of the sort of hangover effects of a lot of government stimuli that they provided to consumers sort of between 2020 and 2022. So, obviously the realized data is different, but we find that this sort of captures the geopolitical component relatively well. Okay. And we also show here the year ahead responses of our transmission variables. In particular, we find that our supply side, our financial commodities prices increase pretty significantly. We see that the dollar appreciates, and this is in line with sort of what we'd expect given an increase in inflation and increase in geopolitical risk. We also see that sentiment on the whole declines in light of a significant global conflict, consumer confidence declined, stock prices decline. So our transmission mechanisms are pretty in line with our main two responses. Okay, so that's about all I have for you today. So just to wrap things up, we see that across a wide variety of exercises, we have hopefully proven to you that when you take a look at the historical perspective, we found that over the last 100 years or so, geopolitical risk has tended to raise inflation on net. We show this through a series of panel regressions and exercises since 1900, where we see that GPR predicts higher inflation through both the supply side, through disruptions in trade and increases in shortages, as well as the expansionary policies of monetary and fiscal authorities, in particular defense spending and money growth. We also see that, of course, there is a degree of heterogeneity across countries, though the results do tend to hold in the cross-section and that they vary over time. Additionally, we also showed a global scenario that simulated the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we saw that in the simulation, geopolitical risk predicts higher inflation through higher commodity prices and dollar appreciation. In particular, when we look only at the shocks that occurred between January and April of 2022, we see that these shocks were estimated to increase global inflation of about 1.5 or nearly 1.5 percentage points. So thank you so much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Maddie. So please raise your hand if you have any question about this presentation or the paper, and we will take the first question from Eliezer Borenstein.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. So just a small question regarding the robustness that you described. Have you checked by any chance the interaction between post-1950 and advanced economies? Just to...
Yes, we did. We did run a few interaction regressions. I don't have the precise estimates on the top of my head. We definitely didn't see anything that was wildly out of line when we interact with, the post-1950s and advanced economies or emerging markets. Obviously, the results are much more attenuated for advanced economies, given that, they didn't experience a lot of, inflation, but we definitely still saw positive responses and, nothing too concerning. But that being said, we do generally see that when you look at the post-1950 sample, this story of, the geopolitical risk effect on inflation is largely one of emerging economies. They've been experiencing the most geopolitical risk, and they've been experiencing the most inflation. So that makes sense when you look at the historical context.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Eliezer and Maddie, for your reply. So now we have a question from Yehuda Porat.
So I guess my big question is, one, the last part, the global part, at least the global monthly part, at least in the presentation, is very underdeveloped, and partly, at the very least, I'd say you should show the updated presentation throughout Ukraine, and it definitely needs comparison with other wars. I mean, you have a global monthly bar and then you use it for one current war. There's a large number of others that, at least some others would be worth testing for, or even generalizing it to, let's look at small period after beginning of war. The other question is about things like advanced economies. There's a lot of variation. If you picked a given set of advanced economies, there's a lot of variation in the size and type of their economies over the last 120 years. I mean, I don't remember if you showed the list of them, but there are many countries that now we might consider that now would come under the developed label that certainly 120 years ago might have different levels of economic development. I'm not sure how much you can generalize that and how much that's kind of an ex post. Well, these are countries that had lower geopolitical risks, and therefore they've developed. Therefore, perhaps that caused development. So you have some kind of endogeneity there, or at least connection or correlation between various explanatory variables. I think I don't quite see why do you think that's general over the whole panel?
Yeah. So with regards to your first comment, definitely like very noted. I mean, it would be very interesting to apply this to a series of different conflicts. I mean, we can at least pick apart the ones from the 1970s. We are constrained, obviously, in our data because we want to keep that monthly frequency. But you know, we really wanted to highlight this more as sort of the potential of a policy exercise that you can apply. At the very least, I mean, we do kind of regret that we haven't, you know, we want to include the updated realization of data, at least for sure, in this Russia scenario. And yes, obviously there are many other examples that we can include. But this we thought provided a very good first initial example. And again, this was born out of the real-time response. So you know, you can kind of take a look at this as sort of a practical policy application. But yeah, so that's sort of your first point. And then your second point, yes, that was something that we had kind of discussed was a bit, how do we slice this sample? And that's why we don't really include the definitions between you know, what is an advanced economy, what is an emerging economy too much. You know, we really mostly use it for that one sort of robustness exercise to try and capture at least some notion of different states of development. Overall, when I think sort of, I don't have like the full list of all of the advanced, or like what we call an advanced economy in our brain. Mostly it's a lot of Western European nations, the United States, Canada. So we would say relative to what we would consider an emerging economy, their states of development have at least maintained relatively in category across our sample. There are obviously a few that have changed, and we even, I think, considered an exercise or like a definition where we changed whether a country was considered an advanced economy or an emerging economy throughout the panel. In this specification, we do keep them constant across the entire sample, but it's something that we've definitely thought about. And yeah, so it's a rough proxy, but one that we thought was still worth looking at and wanted to keep just a clean, consistent kind of categorization.
Okay, thank you
very much. Thank you very much. We have now a question from Fred Jawadi.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very nice presentation. It is more comment and not question, but it is a comment from an econometric point of view. So as I can see, your model did a nice job to track this relationship between geopolitical risk and inflation, taking into account all these control variables. But I would say, how if this relationship is said to be non-linear? We have like some non-linearity in the model. For example, I would say that, okay, this geopolitical tension sometimes are so hard to expect. Sometimes like it is a shock that does happen, like this invasion of Ukraine. So something like that. So this could mean that maybe the reaction of the inflation does vary over the time. And I believe that this relationship could be time varying in the time. So how if we could expect that, for example, the inflation could react differently if it exceeds a given threshold, for example. And if you introduce some non-linearity, some time variation in the model, so that you could capture this reaction per regime, according to the regime or according to the state or the phase of the business cycle. I think it could be something that we can improve the model. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that comment. Yes, I mean, that is sort of something that we have very much fully recognized, is that any sort of measure, when you're looking at something that's looking at risk or uncertainty, you have to start considering the distribution, the non-linearities. So we think we've started to address, again, we run those quantile exercises to start to capture a sense of the distribution. We are pretty careful, while we can't take advantage of the these sort of subsets in our panel exercise. When we look at the global exercise, we do, try and take advantage as much as possible as the distinction between a geopolitical act and a geopolitical threat, where the threats are anything that is orthogonal to an act. So that helps to, again, disentangle some of these concerns. But overall, very much noted. And those are some interesting sort of modifications that we can definitely look into. So thank you. Yeah, very much appreciated.
Okay.
Thank you, Fred. So if we have any other questions from the audience, we maybe ask one or two. So Maddie, thank you very much. It was a very, very exciting seminar and presentation, and of course paper. So I have several questions, comments. I don't know. Take it as it comes.
Have at it. Yeah.
So. So first of all, I think it was most of the questions today related to endogeneity, causality, and identification of this causality. And I do think that at least I have this question in mind. So how are you able to clearly identify the causality, the causal inference, the channel of transmission from your geopolitical indicator to inflation? So yes, this is my first question. My second question is, so would you like to reply and we make one or?
Yeah, I'll just sort of make a brief reply in that a lot of our sort of the basis of our analysis really rests on the exogeneity of the geopolitical risk shock. We really try and make sure that these geopolitical risk indexes capture pretty exogenous shocks. And so we can kind of take the rest of the results that run from that as pretty causal. The Dario Matteo's paper runs a lot of robustness exercises and similar exercises to capture the validity of those indices as the use of a shock. So this project builds a lot on that work. And overall, I would say, I'd point to the timing that we use, for example, in our US specific exercise to begin to sort of validate the transmission mechanism that we have in hand, to start to give a sense of these specific channels. At least as a first step. This is still a work in progress. And additionally, again, while there are endogeneity concerns, we kind of take a spray everything at the wall approach and see that the consistency, given our different specifications, lends credibility to our approach.
No, on that I really agree, and I really appreciate the effort. But I'm also I think I also say that agree with Yuda Porat, who asked this question about why focusing on one geopolitical event, and I will just continue this question, why only on one country? I understand it's a data issue, it could be a data related issue, it could be a lot of constraints, and of course we're not here to make 4 papers from one paper, but the justification, look, we took one country and we test our approach on one event, is in my eyes maybe just the beginning. You should do more, and I think you can.
Yeah. I definitely agree. We can do more. There's a lot that we can do to play around here. I should maybe clarify it. It's not necessarily that we're only taking one conflict. It's not like we're picking an arbitrary conflict. We were really trying to capture a conflict that has global ramifications. I mean, this was something that really disrupted the world order. It was, maybe not unexpected in that the threats were building up for several weeks before the invasion, but definitely sort of rippled throughout, was sort of a pretty significant conflict that upended international relations to a certain degree. So we think that kind of makes it a step above even comparing it to like a desert storm or another conflict in the past. So, it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to consider the global ramifications of every single conflict. So we want to be careful about why we're running these analysis before we just start running willy-nilly. But definitely noted that, this is a first step, but we can do far more. And this provides a good sort of, again, it's a good forecasting exercise. This is something that was done real time. And so we'd need a more real-time things, which, we have and we can take a look at. But that was our logic and our rationale. But there's definitely more to be done.
My second question is, thank you very much for your reply. So my second question is more related to policy question and implications of your work. So if I understand well, so we have a geopolitical event and then this creates inflation. Now, the real policy outcome of your paper is to say to the policymaker what to do. So if I just see your paper and the presentation, I would say, look, she's recommending to raise interest rate after following a geopolitical event. This could harm financial stability or a lot of things, especially I mean in such countries that experience such a geopolitical event. So my question is more, okay, so now how would you build your policy recommendation? How many times this inflation shock or increase remain in the market, in the local market, in the country that you are analyzing, and which kind of policy recommendation would you recommend? I mean, from the paper and the results.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I would take everything here with a grain of salt. For the most part, I mean, we're not decomposing the results in every single country, and every country has different specific compositions. I mean, even just their sectoral composition, their degree of unemployment, so I wouldn't necessarily advocate for taking the results of our paper and applying them blindly to every single country. These are more reflective of aggregate results, over the long run, over a cross section. So that being said, I think the policy takeaway that I would emphasize more is to be, to any policymaker sort of looking at this evidence, is to be very careful about the trade-offs between, the inflationary consequences of a geopolitical event and the real economic activity. While we see that inflation increases, in response to a geopolitical event, and that's mostly what we emphasize in our paper because that's what we're most interested in looking at, that doesn't take away from the fact that it also depresses economic activity. So it's a matter of evaluating what you want to tackle and what you want to tackle on net, and just to be aware that as you may be addressing one question, it may be exacerbating the other. So, as ever, this is a very economist answer. Really depends. You really have to evaluate the trade-offs, and that's something that we highlight in our counterfactual, is that when you mute the sort of expansionary policy response, you see larger declines in GDP. So I would really say to take careful stock of the highest degrees of risk and sort of what you think is the most pressing issue, and to take the results of our paper and bear in mind, the consequences on the other side. So I'm not going to tell you whether or not to raise or lower interest rates, but it's just important to bear in mind sort of the larger view.
Sure. So let me point two things. So the first thing is that I think it could be very interesting to have or to assess the timing. How many times this increase in inflation lasts? Even at the aggregate point of view, even at the US point of view, I do think this is very important for policymakers, after all this debate about transitory inflation and stuff like that. I mean, how much is it transitory? Is it at least, or could it be transitory? I don't know, but I do think that you can, with the results you have, assess how many times this inflation shock lasts. my second question, and could also help maybe to build a policy recommendation, would be related to the effect of the exchange rate. And you said, I think, that on the paper that most of the effect of the increase, and you cite also Gopinath, most of the effect of the geopolitical shock on inflation is transmit through the exchange rate. And I have this question: how much of the inflation shock is due to the exchange rate market or dynamics, and would the policymaker intervene in this forex market to mitigate the inflation shock instead of increasing the interest rate? This could be some path to analyze, and maybe if you have any reply, provide, please. Thank you.
No, I mean, I guess with regards to your question of persistence, I think we can definitely do a bit more to explore that dimension of the data. I mean, you can get at least a bit of a sense from our results that, you know, there is a significant degree of persistence. I mean, for example, in the scenario, again, we can do many others. We see that it's not like this is just a shock that increases inflation and immediately declines. I mean, there is, over the next year, a sustained period of elevated inflation relative to a no conflict counterfactual. So, I mean, I would argue against any sort of maybe transitory, depends on how you want to define your time frame. But I think on the whole, like, we do see the beginnings of evidence of some persistence, and we could probably do more to explore that further. And agreed. I mean, I think we give a sense that, you know, financial variables and, you know, the dollar exchange rate, they do play into our results at the global level. Certainly, we could probably do more, you know, try to incorporate them into our maybe panel dimension a bit more. Again, always a little difficult to try and gather data, and every additional indicator we add adds you know, a lot of work in terms of trying to get long run data, but that would be something interesting to explore. And yeah, I would kind of concede on your second point that we could comment more on it, at least.
I think it would be very interesting, and I think we would be very interested to have more results about these questions. And also, my last question is related to what is impacting the public and the population. For instance, I see you have this decomposition with commodity, oil, and other factors, but could you, maybe not, just tell me if you are able to analyze the effect of a geopolitical shock on food inflation?
I have to think about. I think it's a matter of data availability. I mean, I think we potentially could. I don't see there's no reason why we wouldn't. It's not something that we've totally thought about. We've mostly, again, kept things very to the aggregate level. We haven't started diving into. We received a few other comments with regards to looking more at sort of the within population effects, which is, again, you know, why I alluded to sort of like sectoral impacts and whatnot. Again, that would start to shift a bit of the focus of this paper. But
no, it's just my yes,
yeah,
as a
exactly,
policymaker,
yeah.
I'm asking. I'm not here to
no, absolutely.
Another section in the paper, but I do think it could be very
don't tempt us. But yes, no, I agree, and I think the data is definitely out there on a global level. Again, things are more difficult with our panel, but we could. I think it would depend on the data. I know it's out there.
Sure.
It would be a matter of compiling it, and if so, it would be very interesting to look at.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Okay. So thank you very much, Maddie, for this very, very interesting field of research and presentation, and of course, nice paper. We wish you best of luck for this paper and your research, and of course, your PhD.
Thank you so much. Again, honored to be here, and wishing everyone a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.